Hello and welcome to Play on Nerds, the premiere episode. That's right, episode number 1. Bag it and board it, save it for future generations. It may be worth some money someday. I'm your host, Mark Allen, and with me, the Cato to my Green Hornet,
Rader.
Another challenge for the Green Hornet, his aide Cato, and their rolling arsenal, the Black Beauty.
So, Ron, you want to tell the listeners what they can expect from the podcast, like in general, since this is our first episode, they have no clue what we're doing, and neither do we.
Yeah, I know. It's so funny. It's the first episode, but it feels like we've been talking about this kind of stuff forever, doesn't it?
It does.
This podcast, at least our hopes, is that we're going to be talking about, first and foremost, a lot of tabletop role-playing game issues and topics like Dungeons and Dragons, of course. We're both big fans of the game. We're also going to talk about comic books. Also, both of us big fans of comics. And then movies and television with franchises that tie into tabletop role-playing and comics, the kind of IP that come out of those things. And I'm sure there'll be other things we talk about here or there, but those are the main things and the things that we're really interested in.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And, we definitely want to introduce players and listeners, rather, to, those different topics. But first, we kind of need to introduce ourselves, I guess, and our background a little bit, so they will listen to us and be like, why should we listen to you? You don't know what you're talking about. Well, let's explain why, maybe, and talk about how we got into the geeky culture, I guess. So go ahead and lead off with that, and I'll follow up.
Sure thing. I am a big fan of Dungeons and Dragons. Dungeons and Dragons, as I trip over my own tongue here, and comics, and really tabletop role-playing games in general. I had always been into comics as a kid. I was a kid in the 70s. And really just was reading them here or there, getting them at your local grocery store. In the early 80s, I was introduced to D&D by a friend and his older brother, and immediately fell in love with the game and asked for some Dungeons and Dragons at Christmas. And my parents bought me the Moldvay basic set, and I think at the same time the Cook Expert set. So the two sets went together for, I guess, what you would just call basic old Dungeons and Dragons. Not too long after that, within a few months, I started getting the advanced Dungeons and Dragon books. That's often referred to as 1E by a lot of folks. And so I was a big fan, became a big fan of TSR in general, the producers, publishers of Dungeons and Dragons. Started playing many of their other games, started playing Marvel Superheroes role-playing game from TSR. And at the back of that book, it mentioned if you really want to get into this whole Marvel world and make your game seem more like Marvel, you should buy the Marvel comics. And I started buying the Marvel comics and fell in love with them. It wasn't just grab a comic here or there any longer. It was every week I had to go and buy my fix of comics at the comic store. And 40 long boxes full of comics later, I have a lot of comics and know a lot about comics. But that's sort of how I fell into this hobby, and these hobbies, I should say. And really just love these two areas of geekdom.
It's awesome. It's funny because our stories are somewhat similar in the fact that we grew up in the late 70s, early 80s. And same thing, I got into comic books from my mom purchasing them from grocery stores and such for me, because I was not much of a reader when I was younger or in elementary school. So she'd get the multi-packs, the 3-packs, and they were random, but I started realizing there's a story that goes with these. And, so from there, we just started going to a comic shop and started getting a subscription. And Alf was a big one of mine. I collected all 50 issues of Alf. Maybe I have to turn in a card for that or something. But it was entertaining. What can I say? It was Star Comics was the imprint for that instead of Marvel. But we'll talk more about that in a future episode, I'm sure. But as far as gaming and role-play gaming and such, it was the late 90s that I got started in that. So I was a little bit late to the party on that one. But we started with a game called Torg, which actually stands for The Other Role-Playing Game. It was a multi-genre game, and I thought, wow, this is pretty fun. And then for Dungeons and Dragons, I tripped over my tongue a little bit too. Dungeons and Dragons. That's why we say D&D, folks. I got started with that with 3rd edition, 3.5, and we did play some 4th, and it was enjoyable. But the current edition, 5th edition, I think you would agree that it is the best edition, in my humble opinion, so far, just for playability and introducing new folks to the game and such. But we'll talk more about that later. But I do want to talk a little bit about the history of Dungeons and Dragons, and then we'll kind of move into our table talk, if you will, of role-playing games and different licensing stuffs for Dungeons and Dragons. So the year was 1974. Stephen King was actually a first-time author, and he published his very first novel, Carrie. Richard Nixon was the first U.S. president forced to resign following a scandal. The 55-mile-per-hour speed limit was instituted nationwide to save on gas. And a little company called Tactical Studies Rules Incorporated published a brand new game, you may have heard of it, called Dungeons and Dragons.
I am Dungeon Master, your guide in the realm of Dungeons and Dragons.
And we'll definitely talk more about the history and depth of Dungeons and Dragons in future episodes, about Gary Gygax and how they got started with the ideas and how they kind of came up with the concepts and such. But we just want to call it D&D, I think, from now on, just because it's so much easier than Dungeons and Dragons. So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to our resident DM, my resident DM, because he runs our game, and longtime dungeon aficionado, Ron. Ron, did you want to talk about the licensing debacle with Third and 3.5 and kind of how Pathfinder came out and that sort of thing?
Sure, I can do that. I'll do my best. I'm not an expert at it, and I'm basing it off of what I have seen and read in little quick snippets and articles, and just what I remember from, I guess that was pushing 20 years ago now. But before I do that, if anybody's interested in the early origins of Dungeons and Dragons and TSR, I would recommend the book Game Wizards by John Peterson. It goes into great depth. And one of the things that he does is he takes a look at the historical record. And by that, I mean, he looks at evidence like letters between the individuals involved, purchases, all kinds of business type contracts and things of that type. And it's really interesting as he unfolds in I would say, an unbiased look at how did Dungeons and Dragons actually come about, and then what was the early days of TSR and tabletop role-playing like. So just a little plug for that book. I thought it was terrific. I read it a few months back, and I'm looking forward to reading it again just so I can revisit some of the stories and ideas he had in there. But you were asking about Paizo and licensing debacle and just issues of that nature, which I think is on point because currently Dungeons and Dragons is in its 5th edition, which is very popular. As we know, we play that game in a campaign now for going on 2.5 years. And we introduced a lot of new people to this game, and 5e is perfect for that. 5e is super popular. Wizards of the Coast, who are now the publishers of Dungeons and Dragons, are faced with a conundrum. They need to still sell product, right? So they're getting ready to come out with a new edition, which they're calling it something other than an edition, because they don't want to ruffle the feathers of anyone who enjoy 5e. And the reason that they are a little gun shy with this is because they've experienced something like this before, and that's kind of what your question was going at. So Dungeons and Dragons went through some different iterations, some different editions. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I started playing with what was often referred to as first edition, which is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Now that was like 5 or 6 years into the history of Dungeons and Dragons before there was such thing as Advanced, but for some reason it's called 1E. The second edition, 2E, came out in the late 80s, early 90s. I think maybe 89, I don't have it in front of me, but it was not that much different than the first edition. TSR fell into some financial troubles and they were purchased by Wizards of the Coast, which I'll often refer to as either Wizards or WotC. And WotC didn't make their own edition until a few years after owning the license, the product. And when they did, that edition was called 3.0. They revamped it shortly thereafter, called 3.5 within a year or two. And it was super popular. One of the things they did was they had an open game license. And this is just really simplifying. But what that license said was, hey, you make product for our game. You make the adventures, you make supplements, you've got our rules, you can use it. Nobody's going to be bent out of shape. There's no copyright issues. Just make some product. One of the reasons they did this is because they figured out from looking at the TSR sales records that TSR made a ton of money from the rule books and the core books, and not nearly as much from the adventures, which we referred to as modules. And so WotC thought, let other people do that more risky publishing where you don't make as much money, and we'll just hold down the fort with the core stuff. And that turned out to be a very lucrative lucrative relationship with for WotC with many other smaller publishers. And ultimately, though, it came to a point where they needed to sell more rule books, right? And more core supplements. So WotC came out with 4th edition. And 4th edition was influenced by some of the things that were going on at the time. If I remember correctly, I want to say this is, maybe 2009, 2010. I should have looked these things up ahead of time. So if I'm wrong, I'm not off by too many years. But they were influenced by things like Magic the Gathering, World of Warcraft, other video games, and so they changed the game quite a bit. So 4th edition was very different than any other edition of D&D before, including the still very popular 3.5 edition. One of the things that WotC did, which was a misstep, was they said, hey, we still have an open game license if you want to produce material for 4th edition. However, if you do that and you sign this contract, you can no longer publish material for 3.5. Well, 4th edition wasn't selling that great, and all these smaller publishers who were publishing the modules and other types of resources, they knew that they would make more money if they kept the material for 3.5, because that was the game that most people were still playing. They preferred that version of D&D. Ultimately, what had happened is that one of these smaller publishers who made material for D&D, a company called Paizo, they had ended up taking over 2 of WotC's magazines and producing those magazines for WotC, Dungeon Magazine and Dragon Magazine. So Paizo really knew Dungeons and Dragons well. They were producing material that was very popular, and they saw what was happening with 4th edition, and they started their own game called Pathfinder. Now, since the inception of tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons & Dragons had always been the #1 game, the most popular game. However, because 4th edition was so different than the previous iterations of D&D, and because Pathfinder stuck to a game mechanics that looked very much like 3.5, so much so that people will often refer to Pathfinder as 3.75 edition of D&D, that Pathfinder by Paizo became the most popular best-selling tabletop role-playing game, more popular than Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition. So a few years later, WotC saw the writing on the wall, and so they went back and they came out with 5th edition, which was much influenced by very early editions of D&D, streamlined, much more streamlined than Pathfinder, and very easy for new players to adapt and join the game. And for many reasons that we'll get into in other conversations, I won't get into it right now, there were a lot of other factors that led to people wanting to play tabletop role-playing games. And Dungeons and Dragons, here I am tripping over that word again, 5th edition being so streamlined and so easy to understand and join in as a new player, it surpassed Pathfinder and once again became the most popular tabletop role-playing game. But it was like an explosion or a mushroom, if you will. 5e just took off like no one could ever even had expected. The game is more popular than ever and selling better than ever. And Paizo's Pathfinder, which is now in its 2nd edition, is a distant second-placed best-selling role-playing game. So anyway, we just mentioned all this because we're at a crux right now where D&D now is looking to move past 5th edition. They're scared to use a new name like 6th edition. They're afraid of the same thing happening where people going from 3.5 into 4th edition did not like it, and so they stayed at 3.5. I think they're worried that people are going to do that now and stay with 5th edition and not move on to whatever they're going to call the next edition. But it will be a new edition. I mean, that's what they do. You have to come out with a new edition to sell those core rule books again to keep making a profit. I mean, these companies are in business to make a profit.
Absolutely.
But interesting.
We won't have product to enjoy.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. So interestingly, WotC finds themselves in a similar position that they did back in the, I don't know, what was that, 12, 15 years ago. But I don't know. It's going to be interesting. I think they're going to do okay. It looks like their plan is something a little bit different. They're trying to push everybody towards digital. I don't know if that's going to be great. We'll see.
Not for us old beardy guys that like some of the older aspects of things, just simply because of nostalgia. But yeah, I don't mind some of the D&D digital tools, but something still like dice. I will not roll digital dice.
Yeah, no.
I I have, even during your games that you've run, I have rolled them occasionally, but I'm like, ugh.
Well, here's what I think. WotC seems to be pushing people towards this whole digital platform because they can control everything, right?
Right,
They
absolutely.
control the terrain that you have, that you can purchase and change your terrain. You'll be able to purchase their minifigures and play them online and change the skins. You can buy the books. You can still get a hard copy of the book, but you'll have the digital copy of the book. They're pushing everybody towards that. I think that's a mistake because of what you just said, Mark. And that is people love to collect dice. They love to roll real dice. They love to get minis. They love to paint minis. Some people love to make terrain or buy terrain. I personally love making terrain, but there's something even more important than that. And I don't think it's an age thing. I don't think it's just us, because we have a lot of people in our 2.5-year campaign who are younger than us.
That's true.
People are burned out on the online everything experience. I think it's one of the things that came out of the pandemic where everybody's sitting in these Zoom meetings and doing things online. I think that just burned people out. There's something you cannot replace about sitting around a table with people you care about, people you enjoy being with, you're laughing with, you're having snacks. I just don't think you can replace that with a digital experience.
No, I don't think so. And I'm kind of torn because I do like technology and, some newer technology. I'm not as good with it as, like, say, my kids. But, the pandemic kind of introduced us and jumped us forward about a decade as far as technology goes. But now, like, role-playing games, tabletop games, are way more accessible. Like, I just found a site the other day. I can't remember the name off the top of my head. Play It Now or something along those lines. And you can just register and say, hey, I'm looking for a DM and I'm looking for a game to play this Thursday at 6 p.m. And they'll hook you up with a group online and you can play online with. And I'm like, wow, that's pretty good. Or you can just jump in a campaign and it's free. It's like, wow, that's kind of cool. It's more accessible. If you don't have time to play, you can find time to play. And, if they don't have a time listed that works for you, you can request a time. And they'll, get people together for you and all that and find a DM and all that good stuff. So on one hand, that's great. On the other hand, like you said, meeting face to face, rolling physical dice and that sort of thing, that really is where it's at for me anyway. So I'm kind of torn half and half, honestly. It is what it is, I guess. And, hopefully some of the digital tools will improve and, be better, and some, may not be used. But we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in future episodes. But yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned, like, how WotC made 3.0. And there's something that we failed to mention. With that, it also introduced the world to the D20 system, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's true.
And like, there's a lot of other games that use that same system, even though it wasn't D&D, and it wasn't even licensed by WotC. They had that open license, but off the top of my head, Spycraft I think used D20. There's a few others. Like, it's funny because now a D20 system,
That's the norm, right?
Use it a little bit, I think, but yeah, it's kind of the norm, absolutely, and it is a simple system. I really liked it.
I like it too. It's good for introducing people, but I got to say, I didn't mention them introducing the D20 system, because it would have shown my old man grognardness, if that's a word, because I do miss things like percentile rolls and using the other dice as often. One thing I found is that folks in the past, people always have difficulty at first. Which dice do I roll? Which dice is it? Which one's the 12? Which one's the 8-sided? That's always been an issue, but in the past, people learn the dice, in my opinion, much more quickly because they're using more of the dice in the game. In current iterations, you're mostly just using the 20. I kind of miss the using the other dice more often. I really miss the whole percentile dice being used for thieves/rogues. I always thought that was kind of fun.
Yeah, that's funny you mentioned that, because I was listening to another great podcast on D&D, Critical Role.
Yeah.
I was listening to that recently, and they use a percentile dice occasionally.
Nice.
So it's kind of neat. Mainly for an effect. You have a certain percentage chance of having this magical effect happen, but so it is used, just like you said, not as much. That's funny that you mentioned that, because I'm kind of the opposite, honestly. That's why I like Torg so much in the late 90s. They used 1d20. That was it. And what you rolled on that, you looked up on a chart and you got, bonus based on what you rolled. And then you added your stat. But the new Torg that was just revised recently. So Torg 2.0, I guess they call it Torg Eternity, by a German company. It's phenomenal. I mean, the artwork is great. Storyline's kind of the same, but updated, and it just does really well. They actually still use just a single D20, and occasionally a D6 to add more damage, like if the situation calls for it. So 2 dice is all you need for Torg, which is kind of nice for newer players. It was like, what dice are? Well, here's your D6, here's your D20, and that's it. But yeah, I do miss some of the times of rolling more of the various dice. That's why I like some of my characters to have multiple weapons. You have a great axe and a pistol, because you're going to use different dice for different damage results, right?
Yeah, probably part of it is me just being, it's part of my old school nature. As you know, I mentioned I started with the mold base set back in 81 or 82. So I'm one of those people that just do not like, I like using all the dice. And so I don't know if you've heard of DM, he's a crafting DM, but he just came out with a new game, Scott McFarlane. He goes by DM Scotty on YouTube. And DM's Craft, I think, is his YouTube channel name. But he just came out with a game called Easy D6. And I do want to try it out sometime. But one of the reasons I haven't is because it only uses D6s.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know, it's just this weird little thing I have where it's like, okay, 6-sided dice are for old-fashioned tabletop games. Yahtzee, right? Exactly. So I just can't bring myself. And I keep thinking, I need to order this book and support him. He's such a terrific YouTuber. It's such a terrific part of the gaming community. So I do need to order it. And you can get that at DM's Guild. I just haven't yet because I'm thinking, will I ever play it? Because it only uses D6s.
That's funny.
I know I'm getting off on a tangent here, but
well, because we're old.
Yeah, that's right.
Get off our lawn. It's funny you mentioned that, because I will mention briefly, just because you said it only uses D6s. There's a game that we'll talk about in the future called 4 Against Darkness, and I've talked to you about it.
Yeah, it sounds good.
Oh man, it's like an old school dungeon crawl. Like it harkens back to the early days of D&D. And it's solo play, which I enjoy. And you use graph paper, and it's a lot of fun. I'll get more into it on that particular episode, but it does have a neat mechanic for the D6 that explodes. Every time you roll a 6, you roll again. If you get another 6, you roll again. You keep rolling until you don't get a 6. And certain skills will allow you to explode on a 5 or 6, or and as you level up your characters, eventually you'll start rolling D8s instead of D6. And they haven't introduced any more dice, just D8 and D6. But it's kind of neat, even just with those few dice. Like I said, it really reminds me of the old tabletop game Warhammer Quest, which, you know me, I'm a big Games Workshop nerd, because I actually worked for them back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and I enjoyed my time there and such. And we could say what we want about them, but they're a little bit more strict on licensure and all that stuff. And we'll talk about that in future episodes as well. I remember just every weekend playing Warhammer Quest and just running through adventures. And
what kind of dice do you use in Warhammer? I know nothing about it.
6-sided.
6-sided, that's it?
Yeah. And you're, based on your stats, like if you get 3 attacks, you roll 3 6-sided dice, so.
Okay.
So it's kind of neat.
Yeah, I've never played it. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's kind of neat. And like, depending on your stats, if you have 3 attacks and rolling 3 dice, your attacks may hit on a 3 or better. So, you roll 3 dice. If you get a 4 or 5 and a 6, that's 3 hits, and then you roll to see if you get past their armor. So it's kind of neat. And we'll talk more about Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000 in the future, I'm sure, because another tabletop game that's great.
Absolutely.
But it's less role-playing and more like tactical miniatures game. I affectionately can refer to it as chess on steroids. But we'll talk more about that later.
It's funny you mention another terrific tabletop role-playing game, because as we're sitting here talking, I think I'm finding why I have this proclivity for the non-6-sided dice. And that's because I was into so many TSR games as a kid, not just D&D, because I really loved Gygax. I know, I loved the public personality. I knew nothing about the guy, but the public personality. So anything he was involved with, I loved, which was a lot of TSR stuff. And so I loved Gamma World, Star Frontiers, Top Secret, Boot Hill, on and on, Marvel Superheroes role-playing game. And it just dawned on me, I think all of those games, if I remember correctly, they only use 10-sided. And percentiles. Wow. And that's why I think I love those and I miss those. And a side note, in our next campaign, when we finish this one, if our group decides to go on a second campaign, I was thinking about incorporating the old rogues rules when it came for sleight of hand, climbing walls, and reincorporating 1Es, percentile dice and whatnot, rather than the 20-sided dice. Now, maybe no one will play a rogue because of that, but we'll see. But I digress.
Yeah, we'll see. And by then, some of the newer players will have picked up on things.
That's right.
We can adjust as need be and do some homebrew, if you will.
Yep.
That would be great. And you mentioned the Marvel role-playing game. I never played it, but another old one that we've talked about before, Paranoia.
Yeah.
West End Games, Torque. They did Torque. West End Games did. And they did Paranoia, if I'm not mistaken.
I think they did. Yeah.
Paranoia was just great fun. You can't take it too seriously. I don't know if you've ever played Ron, but it's it's the only role-playing game I've seen where you get a carbon copy of your character 6 times over, because your character will die and die easily. The basic premise is like a dystopian cyberpunk type world where everything is run by a computer. Well, the computer is insane because of all the different programmers. So it has like a multiple personality disorder.
Oh, wow.
And your character will have a security clearance based on the rainbow, Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, so on. And just as an example, it is against the law to go outside the city, period, and see nature. So the computer may send you on a mission to go outside the city, and you need to get in the vehicle. The vehicle only has like a violet security clearance, and you're red. And they're like, "What's your security clearance, citizen?" Violet. You're lying, citizen. So the DM plays the computer, and there's treason points and loyalty points. And everybody has this paranoia, like, who's working against the computer, who's working for the computer, and because your party will not be, you're in it for yourself. You're not in it for anybody else. So it's really funny to see the game master, write down a little tick on a notebook. They're like, wait, was that a treason point? Are you questioning the computer? Another tick, and you're like, oh, no, I wasn't questioning. All hail the computer. And he puts down another point, and you're like, oh no, am I going to die? What time? So, matter of fact, it does include, I mentioned the clones, it includes also the clone cannon, which just was brought back to memory. And it was this gigantic cannon placed somewhere in the city that would shoot clones outside the city if your mission was outside the city. So to where you're at. So no matter where you were, you could get a clone reproduced right there. Newer editions, I think they had transporter technology or something, but it was a lot of fun. Just tongue-in-cheek, goofy, fun game. I never really got a chance to play it too much, but like I said, it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think one of our mutual friends has played it and has told me many times it was a lot of fun.
Oh, yeah. But you mentioned, like I said, you mentioned the Marvel role-playing game. That actually is a decent segue into our comic corner that we're going to discuss moving along.
Sure.
We've discussed off the air about different industry things that's been happening over the last few years, like writing for the trades, as they say. Like you had mentioned that not too long ago, that there's been a shift in the industry. Personally, I don't know if it's because of my old grognardness, to use your word, or the fact that I'm a beer to get, that some of the newer stuff I tried with Rebirth. That's like one of the newer things that I've tried with DC's Rebirth, and I just didn't. I stuck with it for a little while, and meh.
Yep.
But most of the comics I enjoy are from the 80s and 90s. I still go back and reread them because let's face it, the art and the storylines were really well done back then.
For sure.
But currently, what are you reading currently? And
I don't read any current published comics. So I collected pretty hardcore from the early 80s till about 2006, I think. And by then, the concept of writing the monthly comics with the collected editions in mind had pretty much permeated the industry, especially when we're talking about the big two, Marvel and DC. And for me, I just didn't want to read a story that was, taking 6 to 8 to 10 months to finish. Back when we were younger, there could be longer storylines with subplots that extended many, many months, but most of the time you'd have a story finished in 1 or 2 issues, and there was something a little more satisfying about that, and you felt like you got your money's worth. Which, speaking of which, that was another thing by 2006, the cost of comics. The cost of comics now are just so prohibitive. I just don't know how any young person could ever get into the hobby. I know if I were a kid and I was coming to my parents and saying, can I have $5 for a Marvel comic, my parents would have said, "Are you nuts?" But so, and it's easy to say, well, there's inflation, and you get, and just you're so old. Comics were cheap back then, and everything goes up. I did a percentage calculator the other day, so I think if I remember correctly, I was looking at this with my 10-year-old son, and a 60-cent Marvel did at that time. This might have been 2 months ago. Should have been $1.71 in 2022 money, and it's not.
No.
It's $4.99.
Yeah.
It's like
So odd. Well, and dropping subscriptions and stuff, I'm sure,
Yeah.
contributed to that. But
for sure.
oh yeah,
Yeah, the print run on comics are so low compared to when we were kids. They're just super. Back when I was a kid, if you went under, if Marvel or DC went under 125,000 comics printed for that particular issue per month, a comic title was in trouble. It was likely going to be canceled. If you made over 100,000 copies, sold over 100,000, shipped whatever copies of a title on a given month, these days you'd be one of the most successful comics around.
oh absolutely.
It's just pitiful. And I saw recently, it was this summer, there's a person I follow on YouTube. I do not remember his YouTube page, and that was my phone, sorry.
Hello?
The name of his
Yeah.
YouTube page, but he was highlighting that DC had only 2 or 3 titles in the top 100 comics sold for the month.
Wow,
Out of the top 200. They
Wow.
only had 2 or 3.
that's unreal.
It is. It's unheard of.
Yeah, that's unheard of. And it's sad because even like we both collected in the 80s and 90s, and I think I stopped about 2004 is when I stopped collecting consistently. Anyway,
Yeah.
occasionally I still get some, but I tend to go back issues and get some of the older ones. But it's sad to see some of the old, like, I guess second string or independents is what they're known as. Publishers kind of go under and no longer around. For example, I think I've talked to you about it before, is one of my titles I used to collect was Green Hornet, which I absolutely love. Now it's Dynamite, and I've not read the newer ones, but Now Comics used to do Green Hornet. And the Now publishing house they were pretty good. Like, besides Green Hornet, they had a few others. They had, believe it or not, they had the Married with Children title. I never really read any of those.
I think I have a couple of those.
They had Ralph Snart, which was hilarious. It was more adult. And to my, young high school, junior high brain, I was like, this is great. But there's, I digress. There was one called Rust, which I just recently obtained. I've been looking for it for years. And it was a 12-issue series. And the concept was really neat. It was about a police officer who got splashed with chemicals or something, and his body would eat through metal. But he'd slap metal, like scrap metal on his body, on his skin and stuff, to protect him from bullets and whatnot. And he fought crime, but he was one of the first hobo superheroes, if you will. So it was kind of neat. But there's your phone again, but that's okay.
Hello?
The earlier it went off, and it was almost like a cash register ka-ching, because we were talking about sales, so it was perfect.
I know, right? Well,
Sort of. Yeah. Other than that, I used to collect Alf and stuff, but nowadays, like you said, I've not really collected. The heyday for me was definitely like late '80s through the mid '90s. They did some really neat stuff. Marvel Knights comes to mind. Punisher, Welcome Back, Frank. A lot of people give that flack, but that was one of the best 4-issue storylines I think I've read. But in general, we both talk about our love for older comics, the golden age, if you will.
yeah. For me, what I find that I'm currently doing is I have a lot of comics, but I will purchase collected editions, reprints, trade paperbacks, however you want to refer to them, of things that I already own, because I'd like to have them in a nice format. And a lot of things perhaps I didn't get back then from, anywhere between the 60s and I guess late 80s. It's interesting you were mentioning Marvel Knights and whatnot. As much as a lot of those books were great, I think that is when the seeds were sown for what I think is partially the demise of the sales of American superhero comics, and that is, so Joe Quesada was heading that up, and he eventually was successful enough with Marvel Knights that he became editor-in-chief for many, many years at Marvel. But I'm not trying to place the blame on a single individual, but it seems like there's some shared blame there, but he gave Brian Michael Bendis a lot of opportunity at Marvel during those years, and it was Bendis who was the one that really. I'm not saying this was his choice or anything, but he was the guy that was really writing for trades before anybody else was.
Oh yeah.
And then everyone followed suit, and then I'm sure the penny pinchers or the penny counters thought, hey, well, look, wait a minute, we can get these monthlies out and then we can sell them again in trades and on the back end. So let's make sure everybody writes for the trade. I'm simplifying it. Maybe those terms weren't used, but ultimately you had to know that's what they were doing. But anyway, during those Marvel Knights days, that's when that all started.
Oh wow.
And I barely bought any Marvel then. I just never really liked that approach. I'm not saying that there aren't good comics out there that are written under that approach. Especially Bendis has written a lot of great comics. His Ultimate Spider-Man
was
is
amazing.
terrific.
It was great.
Super fun series, but
It's funny. My first Marvel foray, I guess, back in the late '90s. Yeah, it would have been the late '90s. Was the 2099 series of imprint of comic books, Spider-Man 2099, Punisher 2099. I love them. I still have them digitally, actually.
I would say those were probably early 90s.
Yeah, I loved them. They were so good. Just it was fun. They were back when it was fun. DC just went through a change not too long ago, and I talk about being fun. Their CEO from a few years ago, I mean, he's been moved on to other things, but he was actually quoted as, I want to make a comics reader miserable. I want them to suffer for reading comics, basically. This is, not in so many words and not quite so blatant, but, I've talked about that with my friend James a few times, where it's like, wow, how can you run a business that way? It was the former CEO of DC Comics. And I'm just like, okay then. And, his name escapes me, but he was quoted as saying, I want it to be a miserable time for comic readers.
Wonder why he was saying that.
I don't know, but and that's when we started seeing Superman stories become darker and grittier. And it's like, no, Superman's bright and happy. He loves being Superman. He loves flying around and rescuing people. But
well, here's my take on it. I don't want to get too political. This is not a political podcast, but I've heard other people say this in their analysis, and I think they're right. And that is that a lot of people who loved comics and grew up on comics in the 60s started writing them in the 70s through the 90s. But then those people kind of aged out. And what you have now are a bunch of people who are in editorial positions who don't have any history in that. And in those editorial positions, it's people who didn't grow up on it. They don't have a reverence for the material. And ultimately what they do is they want to tell the story they want to tell. It's not dictated by who the character is.
Right, absolutely. But one thing we want to do is kind of challenge each other when it comes to comics. Because I know you've read a lot and you are definitely more of an avid collector than I am. One of the things that I want to do is challenge each other in regards to reading certain things. So let's challenge each other what title the other has not read or has not read in a long time. My challenge for you would be Kamandi, The Last Boy on Earth, written by Jack Kirby. Jack the King Kirby. I think you mentioned you've read it, but it's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while, but yeah, I'll definitely take it out. We were talking about this recently, and I looked up some other people. I think it is Kamandi.
Kamandi?
Yeah. Okay. So I looked up a few different people pronouncing it, and so Kamandi was something that was not super popular in the 80s, so I didn't read it. It was a title not being published any longer for the longest period of time. I have several issues from, I think it was an early 70s comic when when Kirby first went to DC. So yeah, I'm excited to check that out.
Absolutely.
And the one that I was thinking for you would be a storyline, The Judas Contract from the New Teen Titans by Marv Wolfman and George Perez. I think that's like a 4 or 5 issue stories. It's like early 40s, 42 through 44, plus one of the annuals, the storyline. It's a great storyline. Spoiler alert for a 50-year-old or 40-year-old comic. And that's when Dick Grayson goes from being Robin to Nightwing. But it was a really impactful story. I would say that in terms of superhero stories, many people love it. And it's definitely one of my favorite of all time.
I will definitely check that out. And next episode, we will discuss those.
Yeah, sure.
Give our reviews and whatnot. And, one other thing that we want to move on to right before we wrap up is film and television and movies and such, and as far as the geeky nature goes. And we'll do a similar challenge thing in future episodes. But what have you been watching lately? For me, it's been Supernatural. My wife and I, she's watched it before. I've never really watched it. So I'm stuck in the Supernatural loop right now.
What season are you on?
We are on season 4 right now.
Oh, you're stuck for a long time.
Yeah, we're going to be stuck there for a while. Now, don't get me wrong. We will watch an episode here and there of House of the Dragon, or we did watch the first Lord of the Rings, Rings of Power, which wasn't bad. I thought it was good, but I'll be honest, I did fall asleep through part of it because I was super tired.
That's one of the big challenges against that series right now. I know there's a lot of controversy around it, but because not much happens, I'm completely caught up on it. And I will say that's one of the problems with it throughout.
It just seems to drag a little bit.
I was a little annoyed by the fact, too, that, they were worried about trolls and whatnot posting against it, which I kind of think that's ridiculous because who's most likely to do it? A bunch of ununified people sitting in their houses making posts against reviews against a giant corporation, or the giant corporation with all the money who owns one of the review sites, who also said you cannot review for the first 72 hours. Then it became the next 5 hours, and in fact, next 5 days. And I got to say, when I went to review the first episode, I'm a longtime Amazon Prime subscriber. So when I went to review the first episode, I was going to give it a 5. I didn't hate it. I don't have anything against it. But the first episode, I mean, it does. You fell asleep, so it's not exciting.
Yeah,
it would not let me post anything lower than a 6.
What? That's crazy.
Yep. I tried different numbers, and so I went to 6, gave it 6 stars, and was going to write my review. Thought, okay, maybe these guys are up to something. Then it would let me.
Wow.
But if I tried to do 5 or lower, it wouldn't let me. So
that's a scandal right there, I think.
it totally is.
Don't let your people be honest, But
I have watched that whole series. That's the fantasy series I'm watching right now.
Okay.
It's not mind-blowing. I will say the last 2 episodes have been better. It's definitely veers far from Tolkien's ideas. Well, we can go into that in another episode, but it definitely veers far from Tolkien's ideas. But it is fun. It's a fun fantasy series, and like a lot of people says, it looks great. It looks terrific. You can catch up on that when you're done in 8 years with all the Supernatural
with
episodes.
Supernatural, right? Absolutely. And Supernatural is kind of fun.
It is.
But, I've been enjoying that.
Can I give you one slight spoiler that it's not a story spoiler? It's
Sure, go ahead.
it's a thematic spoiler. In my opinion, I think the whole show takes a drastic approach to the storytelling, approach to their weekly stories, their approach to the stories, just the tone and the feeling of the show changes drastically, I think, after the 5th season when Eric Kripke leaves.
Yes, I've actually heard that, and our son has watched the entire thing, our oldest son at home. And he said season 6 is really tough to get through.
I think it's probably true.
Drags, and and I said, well, maybe we should just skip the season 6 and move right to 7. But my wife said, no, we'll power through it. And I'm like, all right. So,
I found 14 brutal too. I could barely get through it. And that was the last one I did. I know I have 1 season to go.
Okay, well, it's going to be a challenge, but I think we're up for it.
They've got a spin-off show coming soon, right? The
yes,
Winchesters?
they do. The Winchesters, and that looks great.
I just saw somebody was cast. Oh yeah, is it Tom Welling? Is he the Smallville guy?
Tom Welling, the Smallville guy. It's funny you mentioned Smallville because I think Supernatural, Smallville. I mean, were they both CW shows?
Yeah.
Yeah, and they have similar writing in regards to what